Thank you all for coming today. I apologize, we were a little late in getting set up. The storm rolled through, but here we are. And we're going to get going while the weather is good. Thanks so much for attending. We appreciate you, and I know many of you are repeat guests here at the First to Fall. And can you hear me okay? Is that better? All right. At this time, we are going to have the presentation of the colors from the Lieutenant Jeffrey DePrimo Post, American Legion Post 542. Present the colors.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to introduce some of our guests. Mr. Jenkins, are you here? John Jenkins? Did you make it? Mr. Jenkins may be here, but he might be a little bit late. Mr. Jenkins has set up a Jenkins Harding Cemetery Preservation Fund, which is what we are able to use now to maintain this very historic spot. And we are incredibly indebted to him. And he doesn't live in the area, but we are hoping he'll be able to be here today. Next, I would like to introduce artist Sue Ham. Sue, can you please stand? There she is. Sue is, and this was news to me, related to Elisha Harding, who was Ben and Stukely's brother. And Elisha is actually the one who had the stone inscribed that you see over here in the cemetery. And I will be reading an inscription from that shortly. Sue has painted this beautiful painting for the Historical Society as a benefit of the actual gravestone of the Harding brothers. And we'll be talking to you a little bit about that in a bit, about how you can become the proud owner of this painting. And many of Sue's paintings are also over at Agolino's. I'm sure many of you have seen those if you've dined at Agolino's. But Elisha's purchase of the stone, there was an initial stone that was hand carved that you can see. It's on the back side of this actual stone. But the stone that Elisha Harding had created originally had the inscription, "Sweet be the sleep of those who prefer liberty to slavery." And unfortunately, that's the part on the bottom that has been lost to history. But we do know from writing that it was originally on the stone, so that's something interesting to know. I would also like to recognize those of you who are descended from our local Wyoming Valley Revolutionary War patriots. Would you stand, please, if you can? Awesome. We will be doing an ancestor photo in the cemetery later on of the Jenkins Harding descendants. If you would like to participate in that, we always like to do that every year. And just a reminder, after our speaker presentation, we will have the 24th Connecticut Militia Group doing their reenactment of a memorial service at the grave of the Harding brothers, featuring a volley and the presentation of the memorial service. In 1917, Elvira Fear, who lived about 2 blocks down the street, was very active in the Jenkins Harding Cemetery Association. She was also a descendant of many of those buried in the cemetery, and she was a president of the local Dial Rock DAR chapter. And she presented to her chapter about the burial of the Harding brothers that took place in 1778 on this ground. And in her speech, she remarked that at one time there was a deep hollow at the back of the cemetery full of large trees, and that would be where those two homes are located. So that was actually a kind of a ravine area. And she said, from this hollow, the Indians watched the burial of Benjamin and Stokely Harding. They hooted and mocked the grief of the weeping friends and family, and except for the presence of a British officer on guard, they would have attacked and scalped the mourners as well. So it's just something to think about today when we peacefully watch the memorial to the brothers. It's just something to think what actually happened there in 1778. Our featured presenter today is Sherry Emershaw, and she's a native of West Pittston.
Huzzah!
She is currently a board member and past president of the Luzerne County, and president as of today still, of the Luzerne County Historical Society, where she's been active volunteer for 14 years. She has chaired and organized many of their fundraising events to preserve and promote local history, including the Road Rally in the Valley, colonial superstitions, folklore and witchcraft, an afternoon of colonial hospitality, the Society's annual dinner gala, as well as participating in many of the Society's tours and programs. In addition, she is a docent at the historical Nathan Dennison House. She also serves on the board of the West Pittston Historical Society and is a member of the Franklin Township Luzerne County Planning Commission. As president of the 24th Connecticut Militia Regiment, she both organizes and participates in local and national events to educate the public about the Revolutionary War in preserving and reenacting the life and times of the common people of Wyoming Valley during the Revolutionary War era. She is also a Civil War reenactor and provides lectures to charitable organizations of the rich history of Luzerne County. Sherry, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mary. Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled with this great turnout for all of you that are very much interested in local history, as I am. Now, when I left West Pittston 40 years ago, I would have never imagined that I would be speaking before an audience in my hometown about two subjects that I care deeply about. That would be local history and Revolutionary War history. What makes the story that I'm about to tell you special is today is the 30th of June, and it was on the 30th of June that the Harding Massacre actually happened. So it is my pleasure to tell you the story of the history of the 24th Connecticut Militia Regiment, the 18th century origin of the 109th Field Artillery. Now, during this speech, I will refer to Westmoreland frequently. Westmoreland is the Northeast Pennsylvania region claimed by Connecticut and used interchangeably with Wyoming, Wyoming Valley, and Wilkes-Barre. To give you an idea of the size of this swath of land, it eventually became counties of Luzerne, Wyoming, Bradford, Susquehanna, and Lackawanna. Now, the story of the 24th Connecticut Militia Regiment and what will eventually become the 109th Field Artillery is very unique. Not only were we in the midst of the dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania for the Wyoming lands, but we had to deal with dangers of frontier life, and adding to all of this, a war for independence. So with so many complicated events happening in, around, and outside of Wyoming at the same time, I have done my best to intertwine them to provide you a concise timeline in story form of the 24th. Now, before I begin the story, I want to set the stage for you. Some of you may not be familiar. The epicenter of the Revolutionary War was in Boston and surrounds. Protest against the many acts passed by the British Parliament upon the American colonies to pay for the French and Indian War led the formation of organized groups in the colonies most notably Sons of Liberty, which was formed in 1765. The Sons of Liberty was formed in 1765. Prominent members in the Boston Sons chapter were Samuel Adams, who was cousin to John Adams, Paul Revere, and John Hancock, who rallied support for resistance with petitions, assemblies, and propaganda. Now, the Sons were referred to by the royal governor of Massachusetts and members of parliament as rabble-rousers. But as time went on, they became more brazen and quite radical, leading to the destruction of property, violence toward British officials, and British loyalists. With protests becoming more and more egregious and violent, in 1768, British troops arrived in Boston, led by General Thomas Gage, to squash the resistance, who would then occupy Boston for the next 8 years. One of the most daring acts in Boston by the Sons that further escalated tensions was the destruction of a very valuable cargo on December 16, 1773, known as the Boston Tea Party. In protest of Parliament's action granting the struggling East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in North America. The event that would force the Second Continental Congress to raise an army to defend the colonies against British forces was Lexington and Concord, which occurred on April 19, 1775, and would be known as the shot heard around the world. With the ever-increasing violent unrest and threat of outright rebellion, General Gage ordered the seizure of weapons and powder being stored in Concord, north of Boston, as a means of disarming the local militia to prevent further resistance. Patriots found out about the plan, and Paul Revere made his famous ride to raise the alarm that the British regulars were on their way. Minutemen and the local militia rushed to confront the British troops in the early morning of 5 a.m. on Lexington Green. No one knows who fired that first shot, but in the end, on that green lay 8 dead patriots. The British then moved on to Concord, where they were met by 400 militia from Concord and surrounding towns. The British decided to retreat back to Boston, and for the next 12 miles, the British were continually ambushed from all sides on what is now known as Battle Road. Approximately 73 British and 49 Americans were killed. Now, word of Lexington and Concord reached the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The largely ad hoc, uncoordinated struggle of the Patriots in Massachusetts now took on a new level, becoming a full-blown rebellion. Congress, with the urging of the delegates from Massachusetts, finally realized that they must come to the defense of the Patriots and that the American colonies were now in official rebellion against the British government. On June 14, 1775, Congress adopted the Continental Army. Resolved that 6 companies of expert riflemen be immediately raised in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, and 2 in Virginia, that each company consist of a captain, 3 lieutenants, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, a drummer or trumpeter, and 68 privates. That each company, as soon as completed, shall march and join the army near Boston, to be there employed as light infantry, under the command of the chief officer in that army. That the form of the enlistment be in the following words: I have, this day, voluntarily enlisted myself as a soldier in the American Continental Army for 1 year, unless sooner discharged, and I do bind myself to conform in all instances to such rules and regulations as are or shall be established for the government of the said army. The next day, on June 15th, another resolution by Congress appoints George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and 2 days later, on June 17th, George Washington receives his commission from Congress. Now, while this was all going on in Philadelphia, another major event happened in Boston, which occurred on June 17th, known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The leaders of the colonial forces learned that the British were planning to send troops from Boston to fortify the hills outside of the city, thereby giving them control of Boston Harbor. In response, the militia occupied Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, where during the night they constructed a strong redoubt and small fortified lines along the Charlestown Peninsula. By daybreak, the British became aware of the presence of the colonial forces and mounted an attack. The redoubt was finally captured by the British after the third assault. Although this was a tactical victory for the British lost many more casualties than the Americans. 1,054 British were killed or wounded, with a disproportionate number of them officers. The casualty count was the highest single encounter during the entire Revolutionary War for the British Army. Colonial losses were 450 killed and wounded. The Americans demonstrated that an inexperienced militia were able to stand up against the mighty British Army. Washington spent a few days getting prepared to take over his new command. He set out from Philadelphia on the 21st of June, and while staying in New York City, he received word of the major Battle of Bunker Hill. Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts to inspect his Continental troops on July 2nd. So, while all these events were happening in Philadelphia and Boston, what was going on here in Wyoming? Well, Wyoming was experiencing its own hostilities since 1762, when the first Connecticut settlers arrived. But they were not with the British government. It was with Pennsylvania. This is known as the Yankee-Pennamite War, the land dispute between the Connecticut settlers and the Pennsylvanians, who both claimed this land. Over the years, resolutions were continually being presented to the Connecticut General Assembly, the Pennsylvania Assembly, and later with the Continental Congress when it was formed, in attempts to stop the violence and come to an agreement of the land dispute. At a town meeting in May 1775, the citizens of Wyoming Valley took the initiative, as noted in the town minutes, to form themselves into companies in ye military way for ye defense of this country. Zebulon Butler was the first commanding officer. He was 45 years old at the time and had experience in warfare during the French and Indian War. When not a soldier, he was a farmer, trader, and shopkeeper who lived in Lyme, Connecticut. After emigrating to Wyoming in 1769, he became an active leader in all of its affairs. However, the most important of these actions that affected Wyoming was taken by the Connecticut Assembly at its October 1775 session, when completing the organization of the 24th Militia Regiment by appointing the various line officers of the regiment. The appointment of the line officers established by the Assembly and commissioned by Connecticut Governor Trumbull completed what the citizens in Wyoming initiated in May. October 17th, 1775 is our birthday, and the companies are as follows. First company, lower half of Wilkes-Barre. Second company, Kingston District. Third company, Plymouth District. Fourth company, Pittston District. Fifth company, Hanover District. Sixth company, the upper half of Wilkes-Barre District, chiefly what we now know as Plains Township today. Seventh company, the lower part of the North District, chiefly Exeter. Eighth company, Blackaway District, Lackawanna. Ninth company, referred to up the river. Upper part of the North District, that would be along the Susquehanna, chiefly near and about Tunkhannock, Bashopin, and Mahoobany. Now, a little about the 1775 militia law. It required that all males from 16 to 50 years of age should bear arms and duly attend all musters and military exercises. Every enlisted man was required to always be provided with and have in continual readiness a well-fixed firelock, the barrel not less than 3.5 feet long, or other good firearms to the satisfaction of the company to which he doth belong. A good sword or cutlass, a worm, priming and priming wire, fit for his gun, and 12 flints, on penalty of 3 shillings for each defect. Each company should choose who was going to be the clerk, who should give his attendance in the field with his sword by his side on each muster or training day, and to keep or call the muster rolls. He would also make out the enrollment lists, twice a year, to be delivered to the captain commanding the company. The clerk would also execute warrants for levying fines against delinquents. Each company was able to designate their days of training and trooping. 3 days' notice was given by the company's clerk. Training days could be in some or either of the months of March, April, May, September, October, and November of each year. During the autumn of 1775, the officers of the 24th began drilling and training their men in military exercise and discipline. Each officer and his men furnished his own arms and accoutrements. The men were not furnished with a uniform, and it is very doubtful that few officers had uniforms. Each officer did, however, wear a distinctive badge of rank, such as a cockade in their hat or a sash around their waist. It should be noted that during the first years of the Revolutionary War, militia organizations within the colonies were not uniformed, except those located in principal towns and cities. Now, the first battle that the 24th participated in was not a Revolutionary War battle, but a battle in defense of Wyoming from Pennamite forces known as the Battle of Rampart Rocks. As mentioned earlier, the land dispute conflict known as the Yankee-Pennamite War was still raging in Wyoming at this time. In early December, the inhabitants of Wilkes-Barre became aware of a planned expedition of some 600 or 700 well-armed and well-equipped men from Sunbury under the command of Colonel William Plunkett, with a mission to strike a decisive blow to the Yankees who settled along the north branch of the Susquehanna River. These formidable preparations being made at Fort Augusta were made known to the Connecticut delegates in Congress then in session in Philadelphia. Zebulon Butler, who was chief militia officer of Westmoreland, was given charge to prepare for the defense of Wyoming and to take command of the inhabitants who responded to the call of arms. Neither the 24th Regiment nor any of the companies composing it were ordered out because the inhabitants were generally called for duty. However, the men who did respond were almost exclusively enrolled members of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th companies of the 24th. Members of the 7th and 8th and 9th dwelt too far away to be of any help in this emergency. Battle of Rampart Rocks was fought on Christmas Day, and the Westmoreland forces were able to repel the Pennamite invaders. The rock ledges where the battle got its name can be seen today as one approaches West Nanticoke driving south on Route 11. After the Battle of Rampart Rocks, the Yankee-Pennamite War was over, for now. Both sides concentrated on fighting the British. On August 23rd, 1776, Congress voted that 2 companies on the Continental establishment be raised in the town of Westmoreland and stationed in proper places for the defense of the inhabitants of the said town and part adjacent to, until further order by Congress. The commissioned officers of the said 2 companies to be immediately appointed by Congress. That the pay of the men to be raised, as aforesaid, commence when they are armed and mustered, and that they be liable to serve in any part of the United States when ordered by Congress. That said troops be enlisted to serve during the war unless sooner discharged by Congress. And on August 26th, Congress elected Robert Durkee and Samuel Ransom, captains of the 2 companies ordered to be raised in the town of Westmoreland. James Wells and Perrin Ross were elected first lieutenants. Assail Buck and Simon Spaulding, second lieutenants. Herman Swift and Matthias Hollenbach, ensigns of said company. Now, before I go any further in this story, I want everyone to understand that during the summer of 1776, Westmoreland and Wyoming Valley was still an isolated and remote frontier settlement. The main concentration of population would have been in Wilkes-Barre. It was strictly an agrarian society, along with tradesmen such as blacksmiths, wheelwrights, carpenters, and such. The estimate of the population vary, but the consensus is that there was close to 3,000 inhabitants. The significant settlements of Easton and Bethlehem were under Pennsylvania control, as was Sunbury. Between Wyoming Valley and Easton was the great swamp that we call the Shades of Death, and mountains only accessible by a small path. In extreme necessity, one could travel quickly via boat on the Susquehanna to Sunbury. Now along the north branch of the Susquehanna dwelt the Iroquois nation, who were a concentrated force at Tioga Point and could reach Wyoming Valley within 24 hours in their canoes at high water. Wyoming was surrounded by hostile Indians and Pennamites and was dangerously exposed indeed. At a town meeting held in Wilkes-Barre on August 28th, with Colonel Butler being moderator for Ye Work of Ye Day, voted that it now becomes necessary for ye inhabitants of this town to erect suitable fort or forts as a defense against our common enemy. A committee of the 24th Regiment and 3 field officers chose the location of the forts. Forty Fort and Pittston forts were enlarged. The Shawnee Blockhouse in Plymouth was enlarged to become Shawnee Fort, and the Gaylord Blockhouse in Plymouth was stockaded and became the Gaylord Stockade. The Stewart Blockhouse in Hanover was strengthened. The Wintermute's family home in Exeter was stockaged and later became known as Wintermute Fort. Fort Wyoming on the River Common in Wilkes-Barre, having been demolished in 1774, so Fort Wilkes-Barre was built and is located what we now know as Public Square. News of the Act of Congress establishing the 2 independent companies be raised together with the men appointed as officers in Westmoreland reached Wilkes-Barre on September 1st. The war for independence had now reached Wyoming. According to historian Charles Minor, the rendezvous for the enlistment of men on the terms prescribed were opened by Captain Durkee on the east and Captain Ransom on the west side of the river. According to historian Oscar Harvey, the first day, 31 men presented themselves for enlistment, and in less than 16 days, each company was recruited to the maximum fixed by Army regulations. Each recruit would sign the enlistment form that I quoted earlier when Congress created the Continental Army in June of 1775. On September 10th, Congress voted that Major William Judd of the 24th be authorized and directed to muster the 2 Westmoreland companies, which was done on September 17th. The officers and men of these 2 independent companies furnished their own arms and accoutrements. At this time, uniforms for the various units of the Continental Army had now been adopted, but Congress did not have the money to supply the troops for their uniforms and clothing of any kind. In addition, they could only furnish very limited arms and accoutrements. The troops from the Connecticut in 1776 were either wearing a uniform or parts of a uniform, and other equipment used by their fathers, or simply what was used for home defense and hunting. On October 10th, 1776, a 10th company was formed, located in Huntington and Salem townships, which we would know as Shikshini. There was no captain at its formation. Lieutenant was Frias Wood, and ensign was John Franklin. The headquarters of the 2 Westmoreland independent companies was in Wilkes-Barre. They were treated as a battalion. Captain Ransom commanded the battalion as well as his own company. Colonel Zebulon Butler was paymaster and commissary in the Continental Service. There were no barracks. Those who resided in or near Wilkes-Barre would lodge in their homes, while those residing in more remote locations were hosted by certain households in Wilkes-Barre. Each day, the men would drill and do other tasks until the middle of December. Now, it was during this time that Captain Durkee was tired of his dull and monotonous duties at Wilkes-Barre, and frankly, he was getting bored. Like any soldier, he wanted to be in the fight, and he decided to visit General Washington at his headquarters in Bucks County to see if he could get more active service. Now, Captain Durkee could not have picked a better time to plead his case to Washington. Washington was in dire need of more troops and kept appealing to Congress for soldiers who would not only enlist, but enlist for longer periods of time, including the duration of the war. Washington was constantly dealing with men serving only weeks or months at a time. Meanwhile, Congress left Philadelphia to avoid capture by advancing British forces and moved to meet in Baltimore because the movement of the enemy now rendered this city a seat of war. They got out of Philadelphia with little delay, but before they left, they passed the following resolution. Resolved that the 2 companies raised in the town of Westmoreland be ordered to join General Washington with all possible expedition. A few days later, Captain Durkee quickly returns back home and immediately prepared for the departure of the 2 companies for the front. Arrangements were made by Colonel Butler to provide pack horses and provisions for the troops. On January 1st, 1777, accompanied by Colonel Butler, they set out to march to join Washington at Bucks County. When Westmoreland companies reached Easton, they learned that Washington had crossed the Delaware and fought the victorious battles of Trenton and Princeton in New Jersey and was marching toward Morristown. After staying at Easton for a rest, the troops reached Washington's winter headquarters in Morristown on June 9th. And so began the 2 Westmoreland independent companies' service in the Continental Army. On a side note, back in May in Wyoming, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dennison was promoted by the Connecticut General Assembly to Colonel of the 24th Regiment of Foot in this state, in place of Colonel Zebulon Butler, now in service the Continental Army. Thus, Nathan Dennison became our 2nd commanding officer. Now, 1777 was an active year for the 24th Independent Companies, for the fight of independence. They participated in the following. January 20th, skirmish at Millstown, Somerset County Courthouse, New Jersey. April 11th, the Battle of Bound Brook, New Jersey. September 11th, the Battle of Brandywine, Pennsylvania. October 4th, Battle of Brandywine, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Germantown, Pennsylvania. November 12th, a detachment from the 2 companies is drawn as a relief of Fort Mifflin, located on the Delaware River near Philadelphia under Lieutenant Spaulding. December 19th, the 2 companies move into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The year 1778 was going to be another busy year for the 24th. April to May, the Wyoming Independent Companies guard Hessian prisoners at Lancaster, Pennsylvania. June 28th, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey. Now, if any of you are listening carefully to my date and year, you know we are now approaching the pivotal date of July 3rd, 1778, when our enemy invaded Wyoming to wipe out the settlement known as the Battle and Massacre of Wyoming. We know what our 2 independent companies were doing serving in Washington's army. What about what was happening in Wyoming? And what about the 10 companies that remained in defense of Wyoming? Well, the year 1778 brought great fear to the inhabitants of the frontier, but particularly in Wyoming. It was well known by Congress in early 1778 that a large force of British troops was gathering at Fort Niagara in northern New York. This force would be joined by Mohawks, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas with the mission to wreak havoc with fire and slaughter on the frontier settlements of New York and Pennsylvania. There was no doubt that Wyoming would be a target. Other than the local militia consisting of older men and younger boys, Wyoming was virtually unprotected. It is also well known that the Wyoming settlements furnished the Continental Army a large quota of men compared to the other settlements, thereby making it known of their support and enthusiasm to the American cause. Bountiful crops were harvested because of the rich, fertile lands of Wyoming. So in addition to men, they were amply supplying the Continental Army with food and provisions. This certainly caught the attention of the enemy in New York, planning a campaign, and it became their firm belief that the Wyoming settlement must be destroyed. Even back in 1777, there were continued encounters with Indians and Tories who threatened the Westmoreland settlements, especially during the fall. September 1777, Colonel Dennison receives intelligence that a number of Tories located in the northern Westmoreland region returned to their homes after joining the enemy during the spring at Fort Niagara. Knowing their intentions, Colonel Dennison immediately sent a detachment from our regiment in search of the Tories, whereby taking 2 prisoners and killing 1. In a report to Brigadier General Wolcott, commanding the 6th Brigade of the Connecticut Militia, Dennison wrote from Westmoreland on September 20th, 1777, about the encounter. Since this happened, I find that some of them have gone to the Indians' settlements on this river. Others are lurking about their families, so that if it is in their power to bring Indians upon us, it will be done. Further encounters. October, Lieutenant Asa Stevens, with 9 men, scouted up the river and returned with 5 suspected prisoners. November, Lieutenant John Jenkins Jr., in command of a scouting party, was captured near Wyalusing and taken prisoner to Fort Niagara. December, Colonel George Dorrance, commanding a force of 111, captures 28 suspected prisoners near Towanda. Colonel Nathan Dennison wrote to the Connecticut delegates in the Continental Congress, "We are not without fears that the Indians will molest this country, as we hear daily of their threats." He urged them that the 2 independent companies may be returned to their former station with honor to themselves and the country. I should earnestly entreat you to have this accomplished. The year 1778 began with the opinion of the inhabitants of Wyoming that they were in imminent danger. In early January 1778, the Connecticut Assembly convened in Hartford for a special session. Nathan Dennison was present and wrote a memorial on January 26th, where he detailed the threat to Westmoreland from the Tories and the Indians and the encounters they had experienced. He humbly beseeched for more ammunition and for wages and expenses of the officers and men in defense of Westmoreland. In the meantime, British Major John Butler was busy entering into a new treaty with his Indian allies. He clearly understood the necessity of destroying the frontier settlements. In the spring of 1778, he corresponded with the British military and declared that he would march with his Rangers and Indian allies to the Pennsylvania frontier as quickly as possible. It was decided that Wyoming would be the first to be attacked for several reasons. They could easily and quickly be reached from New York by way of Susquehanna. They were exposed as a remote frontier settlement and virtually unprotected. And Congress had not sent any Continental troops to protect the frontier. On March 16, 1778, Congress finally acted and ordered a third independent company to be formed to aid in the defense of Wyoming. Resolved that one full company of foot be raised in the town of Westmoreland, on the east branch of the Susquehanna, for the defense of the said town and settlement on the frontier in the neighborhood thereof, against the Indians and the enemies of these states. The said company to be enlisted to serve 1 year from the time of their enlisting, unless sooner discharged by Congress. And on March 19th, the Honorable Jonathan Bayard Smith wrote to the President of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. Upon an application from the settlers at Wyoming, or as they call it, the town of Westmoreland, Congress agreed to establish one company of troops there for its immediate defense for 1 year. Shortly after, Dethick Hewitt of Kingston, who had been captain of the 2nd Company of the 24th Militia, was commissioned captain of the new 3rd Independent Company and began to recruit men. In the May session of the Connecticut Assembly, Representative Anderson Dana wrote a petition on June 10th to the Assembly of the dire situation in Westmoreland, and that he had received intelligence from Westmoreland that the Indians appear very surly and insolent in the upper part of Westmoreland, which gives reason to the inhabitants of said Westmoreland to believe that the Indians intend to make war. The first reliable information of the threat was provided by Lieutenant John Jenkins, who you may recall was captured and taken prisoner to Fort Niagara when he escaped and returned home on June 2nd. Jenkins brought information about a large number of Tories up north along the Susquehanna who wintered at Fort Niagara while he was there and were going to return to their homes with the British and Indians, drive the settlers off, and take possession of the country. Since Jenkins escaped from Niagara in April, he was not aware that Major Butler, along with his Rangers and Indian allies, had set out from there a month later. Nor were the inhabitants of Wyoming aware that Butler arrived on the northern border of Westmoreland. On the 1st of June, Colonel Zebulon Butler arrives in Wilkes-Barre on leave from the Continental Army, and he quickly learns of the threat of invasion and immediately rides to York, where the Continental Congress is in session. He requested to the Board of War that the 2 Westmoreland independent companies be sent back to Wyoming for protection. He then returns back to Wilkes-Barre around the same time that Colonel Dennison arrives home from Hartford. Both Butler and Dennison, assisted by various officers of the 24th Companies and civil authorities, began to make preparations for the defense of Wyoming. Almost daily, spies and scouts were sent up the river as far as Wyalusing to gather what information they could. Now let us return to our 2 independent companies serving with Washington. Our 2 independent companies had since detached from Valley Forge in April and were guarding prisoners of war in Lancaster. While in Valley Forge, some of our members of the 2 independent companies were ordered to join the 4th Connecticut Regiment, as ordered by Congress, to supply more men. Our 2 companies' numbers were considerably reduced by death, desertion, discharges, and now those who fell into the 4th Connecticut. When Captain Sturkey and Captain Ransom learned of the threat to Wyoming, they resigned and started for home immediately, along with 25 other enlisted men who deserted to return to Wyoming Valley in time to take part in the Battle of Wyoming. Because the numbers were so drastically reduced, the 2 companies were combined into one, and Lieutenant Simon Spaulding was made captain. The company left to go to Wyoming on June 26th. Back in Wyoming on July 1st, our regiment was assembled, led by Dennison and Butler, to recover the bodies of the Hardings who were killed the day before in an ambush by Indians on the west bank of the river near Sutton Creek, thinking they would encounter the enemy, but they did not. The mutilated bodies of Benjamin and Stokely Harding were recovered and buried in the cemetery before us. The Wyoming inhabitants now knew that invasion was imminent, but the precise time was unknown. On July 1st, Fort Wintermute was surrendered, and Fort Jenkins here in West Pittston fell on July 2nd. The 24th was disposed as follows. 1st Company, Lower Wilkes-Barre, at Fort Wilkes-Barre. 2nd Company, Kingston, at Forty Fort. 3rd Company, Plymouth, at Forty Fort. 4th Company, Pittston, at Pittston Fort. 5th Company, Hanover, at Fort Wilkes-Barre. 6th Company, Upper Wilkes-Barre, at Fort Wilkes-Barre. 7th Company, Exeter, at Wintermute and Jenkins Fort. By now, they were either casualties or prisoners. 9th Company, up the river, disorganized because of its proximity to the enemy in the northern location. 10th Company, Chickasha, received orders at 9 a.m. to march to Forty Fort. Captain Spaulding's independent company was en route from Lancaster. Captain Hewitt's partially organized 3rd Independent Company at Forty Fort. On the morning of July 3rd, Major John Butler demanded an unconditional surrender of all the forts of the valley, which was refused by Colonel Dennison. Dennison then ordered the 1st, 4th, 5th, and 6th companies to march to Forty Fort. All companies reported for duty by noon except the 4th Company of Pittston due to lack of boats, so they remained in Pittston Fort. The 10th Company arrived at noon after a march of 21 miles. The number of soldiers assembled at Forty Fort was close to 400, along with many more women and children. Around 2:30, approximately 375 soldiers marched out of the fort in column formation, headed by Colonels Dennison and Butler, who were both mounted. Now, the Battle of Wyoming began around 5 o'clock and was fought in today's borough of Exeter. The battle lasted only a half hour, with the massacre that evening for those soldiers who sought quarter. At 4 o'clock the next day, Major John Butler and his forces marched into Forty Fort, where he and Colonel Nathan Dennison signed the Articles of Capitulation. 200 of our 375 men were killed in the battle. Among them were Captains Durkee and Ransom, who had previously resigned from their posts guarding prisoners in Lancaster in order to get back home to protect their homes and families against the enemies. Days after the battle, Indians terrorized the inhabitants of Wyoming by threatening their lives, robbing them, burning their homes, destroying their crops, and driving off or killing their livestock. Most left in haste in the virtual depopulation of the valley. Captain Spaulding halted his company while marching to Wyoming when he learned that the battle had already been fought, and he regretted that he had not arrived earlier. Although he was unable to fight in the battle, he was able to provide to the fleeing refugees help. He then marched to Fort Penn on the Delaware. In response, Colonel Thomas Hartley was ordered to aid Wyoming Valley in removing the Indian threat. On August 4th, Colonel Zebulon Butler returned to Wyoming Valley with 34 men of various companies of the 24th Companies, along with Captain Spaulding's independent company. They proceeded to drive away some Indians and set up a post where civilians and soldiers were quartered. Soldiers continued to maintain peace and order. On September 14th, Captain Spaulding with 58 men and Captain John Franklin with 12 men of our regiment marched to Muncie to join Colonel Hartley's punitive expedition to Tioga Point. There, they fought Indians, Tories, and Butler's Rangers in retaliation for the Wyoming massacre. After a dangerous journey of fending off Indian attacks on his way back to Wyoming Valley, Colonel Hartley finally returned to Wilkes-Barre with 200 men on October 2nd. Colonel Hartley left Wyoming Valley only a few days after his arrival. Before his departure, Hartley left some of his men to reinforce its defense. The Indian threat was not eliminated, and Hartley warned the authorities to send reinforcements quickly because Wyoming was still very vulnerable. Colonel Zebulon Butler assumed command with Hartley's departure, with the refugees returning back to the valley. He enlarged the fortifications and built a new fort on the River Common in Wilkes-Barre, just north of the junction of River and Northampton Streets. It is named Fort Wyoming. The routine of garrison life is resumed as Indian raids continued to take their toll on the returning inhabitants. Now, on November 11th, a horrific attack led by Major John Butler's son Walter, along with Tories and Native American allies, attacked the Cherry Valley settlement in the Mohawk Valley, New York. The strategy by Major John Butler to destroy the frontier settlements in Pennsylvania and New York in order to allow an invasion of British forces from the north to defeat the Continental Army was especially brutal at Cherry Valley. Like Wyoming, Cherry Valley was another breadbasket for the supply of provisions to the Continental Army. 30 civilians were killed, 70 taken captive, and as in Wyoming, homes, barns, livestock, and crops were destroyed. General Washington finally had enough, and he wanted to put an end to the Indian threat once and for all. Not only did the attacks on the frontier settlements cause death and hardship for the settlers, Washington knew it left the United States vulnerable for an invasion from British troops and their Indian allies from the north, threatening the war effort and possible defeat of the Continental Army. He knew he would have to take the fight to Indian Territory to wipe out the Iroquois Confederacy, who aided the British troops. Now let us return to Wyoming. We opened the year 1779 with the ongoing return of inhabitants who fled Wyoming Valley after the Battle of Wyoming to rebuild their homes. With the increase in population, Indian raids were becoming all too frequent, and many were killed and taken captive. In March 1779, Washington appoints Major General John Sullivan to command an expedition to remove this threat. General Sullivan arrives at Easton on May 7th and establishes headquarters there and begins organizing the campaign. General Washington writes to General Sullivan on May 31st with instructions relative to the campaign. He declares that the immediate objective of the campaign is for the total destruction and devastation of the settlements of the Six Nations, as well as their adherents and associates, and the capture of as many people as possible of every age and sex. He further directs Sullivan to detach parties to lay waste all the settlements around, with instructions to do it in an effective manner in the country, so that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. On June 10th, General Sullivan left Easton to begin his march to Wyoming, and he arrives at Fort Wyoming on the River Common in Wilkes-Barre on June 23rd. Part of Sullivan's forces was Captain Spaulding's independent company, and a company commanded by John Franklin, which was made up of various surviving members of the former companies of the 24th. Other troops were Proctor's Pennsylvania Artillery Regiment, 1st, 2nd, 3rd New Hampshire Regiments, 1st, 2nd, 3rd New Jersey Regiments, German Regiment, 11th Pennsylvania Continentals, Scott's Independent Corps. On July 31st at noon, a cannon was fired, signaling for Sullivan's army of 3,300 men set out and marched northward up the Susquehanna to New York. Accompanying the troops were 214 boats laden with provisions, cannon, and munitions. Following in the train were 1,220 pack horses and a herd of beef cattle, 600 beef cattle. At 1 o'clock, of the firing of the cannon from Colonel Proctor's flag boat, the Adventure, was the signal for the boats of the fleet to weigh anchor. This certainly must have been a sight to behold on the River Comet in Wilkes-Barre. The Sullivan expedition was successful and included the Battle of Chemung and Newtown. General Sullivan carried out his scorched earth campaign, destroying 40 Iroquois villages along with their crops, livestock, and food stores. The Iroquois Confederacy never fully recovered from this devastating blow. Sullivan's army returned to Wilkes-Barre on October 7th, and after resting a couple days, he departed back to Easton on October 9th. Captain Spaulding's Westmoreland Independent Company, a few remaining men of our regiment, the German regiment, and a small additional body of troops were detached by order of General Sullivan to garrison Fort Wyoming under the command of Zebulon Butler. Colonel Butler continued in command of the post and was charged with the protection of the returning inhabitants, guard the entrances to the valley, and surveillance of the surrounding area. Efforts to have additional troops sent to Wyoming were ineffective, and Captain John Franklin reorganized the remaining members of the 24th Regiment. Now, after the success of the Sullivan expedition, combined with Spaulding's company that consisted of the men of what remained of the 1st and 2nd Independent Companies that served in the Continental Army, and along with what men were left of the 10 companies of the 24th Militia, would be reorganized. The company of 74 officers and men was on duty from April 3rd to May 4th, 1780, at the post of Wyoming. Sometime in 1781, it was incorporated in the Connecticut Militia, becoming the first company of the 5th Regiment. On December 30th, 1782, the court at Trenton made a pivotal decision and decreed that Wyoming belonged to Pennsylvania. It stated, "The jurisdiction and preemption of all territory lying within the charter boundary of Pennsylvania, now claimed by the state of Connecticut, do of right belong to the state of Pennsylvania." Captain Spaulding's company was mustered out of the Continental Service in 1783. In November 1785, the Connecticut settlers organized a new militia regiment, electing Captain John Franklin and Lieutenant John Jenkins Jr. to be colonel and major respectively. At this time, the jurisdiction of Connecticut over Wyoming had ceased, but the county of Luzerne had not yet been formed. This temporary arrangement had no official standing, and on September 25th, 1786, Luzerne County was finally formed. Under Pennsylvania law, Colonel Zebulon Butler became county lieutenant in charge of the militia. Wyoming Valley had less than 1,000 eligible men for military duty, so the men of the valley were reorganized on November 3rd, 1787, as a battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Matthias Hollenbeck, with 8 militia companies stationed at Upper and Lower Districts of Wilkes-Barre, Upper and Lower Districts of Hanover, Upper and Lower Districts of Kingston, Plymouth District, Salem District. On April 11th, 1793, these 8 companies were designated a regiment and were known as the 3rd Regiment, Luzerne County Militia, commanded by Matthias Hollenbeck. Matthias Hollenbeck, who had fought in and survived the Battle of Wyoming, became our 3rd commanding officer. On April 9th, 1799, it is reorganized again as the 35th Regiment. So closes the 18th century and the name, the 24th Connecticut Militia Regiment. But the story does not end there. Under its new name, it would continue to metamorphosize and change names over the next 100 years, eventually becoming the 109th Field Artillery that we are all familiar with today. So when did the 24th Connecticut Militia Regiment eventually be designated as the 109th Field Artillery? After many previous reorganizations, redesignations, musters in, musters out over the years, on October 11, 1917, it was officially reorganized and redesignated as the 109th Field Artillery assigned to the 28th Division. From its humble beginnings at a town meeting in 1775, when the inhabitants of a frontier settlement took the initiative to form a militia to defend themselves, the historic 109th Field Artillery has served the United States with distinction, honor, and sacrifice in defense of our nation. From the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812, the Mexican War, Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the War on Terrorism in Iraq. The 109th is one of a few regiments in the United States that can proudly fly flags from two states, Connecticut and Pennsylvania.
Sherry, that was incredibly enlightening, and I know she did an amazing amount of research to put all of that together, and really explains the whole process, and we're very grateful we've had you speaking today. And I will remind you that our presentation today, it will be on our YouTube channel, the West Pittston Historical Society YouTube channel. So if you want to review anything or catch up on anything that you missed, feel free to, or share that with friends and family who've not been here today. Also, we will be posting, Carl Rosenkrantz, one of our Historical Society board members, put together a beautiful video that kind of explains the events leading up to the battle. And unfortunately, with the weather being what it was, we couldn't quite get our screen together and get it all set up for you. But we will put that on YouTube as well, so you'll be able to see that. And hopefully we'll be able to put it up next year and be able to have it as an event leading into the program. At this time, I would like to explain to you a little bit more about Sue Hand's painting. And we're going to be doing a silent auction, and if you would like to become the owner of this, I will be putting out a link for a Google form that you can submit your bid. And if you're not somebody that goes online and doesn't want to do that, we have printed out forms in the back that you can just take with you and either mail to us or email to us your high bid. And it has a place for your information. We also have items for sale in the back, and if you want to take out a membership, you can do that as well. But I'm so grateful to Sue for producing this painting. It's absolutely spectacular. And I want to get a picture of you with it before you leave today. So, no, it does benefit us, but you know, without you, we couldn't make this happen. So thank you. At this time, I will invite you to listen to Mr. Rosenkrantz. He's going to speak a little bit and give a closing before we move over to the cemetery.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for being here. As chair of the First to Fall Committee, we got this going when COVID was winding up. So 3 years after, on the 246th anniversary of the Harding Massacre, I'm pleased that we are all here and that we are honoring them. So at this point, though, I would like to say thank you to a number of people who have worked hard to make this possible. So I'm going to start with some of our biggest supporters, Howell Lucy Funeral Home and Dion Fernandez, Sherry Emershaw, who gave a great speech, the Melberger family, who owns the property that we're on, Sue Hand and her family for a fantastic portrait. Thank you again. Joe and Paula Panzita, the little video that Mary's going to put up, I've had the privilege of going onto their property, which is the Harding cornfield, and they actually still are finding arrowheads, but they were nice enough to show me the property, and it probably looks a lot like the fields as they were back then. Also, William Joyce, Mark and Sue Farrell, Big Top Rentals, Lou Champy from Independent Graphics, Tom Oberzit, who is a board member, was our media relations person, Also like to acknowledge the Wyoming area football team players and Coach Spencer, who helped set up yesterday. Also, I'd like to acknowledge our First to Fall committee, and if you would show yourself upon hearing your name. Mary Portelli, our president, Judy Aida, Cheryl Butera, Tom Oberzit, and Bill Rowe. Thank you for all the hard work. Additionally, I would just also like to recognize our Historical Society board members at large, and I'm going to read them off. Drew Smith, Judy Aida, Mary Portelli, John Kearns, Tom Oberzit, Ellen Quinn, Judy Stevenson, Bonnie Baird, Jackie Brozina, Cheryl Butera, Sherry Emershaw, Bill Rowe, and Chip Rubel. Again, thank you very much. At this time, this is going to conclude our presentation. I'm going to invite everybody to go
Carl,
over to the cemetery.
Carl, we need to thank Mayor Alfano for generosity today.
A good friend. I think I go back with Ange to the Harding massacre. But Angela, thank you. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, I have some interesting documents up front. If anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much. And again, at this time, we're going to proceed over to the cemetery, and the 24th Regiment is going to give a burial service on behalf of the Harding brothers. Thank you.